My sister wanted to be the bride at my wedding, so I let her stand outside in her white dress. My birthday cake was always her favorite flavor. My Christmas gifts? Whatever she didn't want. When my parents demanded my sister wear a wedding dress at my ceremony, I realized I'd never been their daughter, only her shadow. I was born into a family where love had limits, and none of it was reserved for me. From my earliest memories, I understood I wasn't the child they wanted. My sister, Jessica Parker, was worshipped like a gift from heaven, while I remained the unwanted excess, the afterthought, the burden. My parents, Richard and Susan Parker, never bothered hiding their favoritism. I quickly learned that in their eyes, I could never outshine Jessica. But that didn't stop me from trying. My birthday cakes, always Jessica's favorite flavor. When I protested, my mother would feign innocence. "Oh, I thought you liked this flavor too." Christmas presents? Jessica received the newest, most beautiful toys, while I got something insignificant or nothing at all. Whenever Jessica and I fought over toys, who always took the blame? Mother never needed the full story. If Jessica said I was wrong, I was punished. Family outings? If it was Jessica's occasion, we went wherever she wanted. If it was mine, I couldn't choose because Jessica doesn't like that place. Even on my birthday, we'd end up at Jessica's favorite park. At first, I didn't recognize the injustice. I believed Jessica was simply better than me, more lovable, which explained why our parents favored her. But as I grew older, I couldn't fool myself anymore. When Jessica accused me of something, my parents never needed proof. If Jessica said I was wrong, they believed her instantly and punished me. If I accused Jessica, they'd scoff, "Come on, Emily, don't be so selfish. Why do you always cause trouble?" Even with clear evidence against Jessica, they'd reduce her punishment, then scold me for not knowing how to compromise. I gradually realized I had no voice in this family. If I cried, they said I was pretending. If I stayed silent, they called me sulky. If I fought back, they labeled me disrespectful. So I stopped fighting. I became a shadow. But there was one thing they didn't know. I might be suppressed and hurt, but I would never forget. The injustice they inflicted would be carved deep into my heart, waiting for the day I could reclaim what was fair. As children, Jessica mostly ignored me, treating me as if I were invisible. But everything changed once we entered our teenage years. The passive neglect transformed into active hostility. Jessica had no friends. Her selfish, domineering, and spiteful personality drove people away. Meanwhile, I managed to form genuine friendships with people who actually cared about me. Jessica despised this. She could no longer ignore me. Now she wanted to destroy me. I transformed from a shadow into a target for her rage. Jessica began fabricating stories, falsely accusing me and my friends of wrongdoing. Whenever I wanted to go out, she'd spin tales. "Emily's hanging out with bad influences, you should forbid her from going." Or, "Emily is so inconsiderate, why can't she stay home and enjoy family time like I do?" My parents believed her without question. I was forbidden from going out while Jessica basked in her victory. Gradually, I lost my social connections, becoming isolated in my own home. Fortunately, our extended family still showed me affection. During a family gathering, my cousins invited me to join them for an outing. I responded sadly, "I'm not allowed to have friends because Jessica doesn't have any." That statement reached the ears of our relatives, who confronted my parents in anger. My parents were humiliated, but instead of changing their behavior, they punished me. 1 month of grounding for lying to embarrass your parents. Yet from that point forward, they eased their most extreme restrictions on my social life. Jessica never forgot that humiliation. She demanded to change schools, and my parents immediately agreed despite the higher tuition. But she didn't stop there. When she finally made new friends, she brought them home specifically to torment me. If I invited friends over, she'd accuse them of stealing, and my parents would believe her instantly. When I got my first boyfriend, Jessica decided to take him from me. She deliberately attempted to seduce him with revealing clothes. When he rejected her advances, she accused him of harassment. My parents believed her without hesitation and forced me to break up with him. This scenario repeated with my second boyfriend, and I gradually lost faith in love altogether. Jessica's behavior escalated, and my parents grew increasingly blind to her manipulations. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't the same weak little girl anymore. I had learned to wait. I had learned to fight back. And I wouldn't let them win forever. The summer before senior year marked a turning point. Jessica's cruelty reached new heights when she accidentally spilled bleach on my prom dress the night before the dance. My mother merely sighed, "Oh, Jessica, be more careful next time," while I was left with nothing to wear. That night, as I sobbed in my room, something inside me hardened into resolve. I started keeping detailed records of Jessica's lies. I installed a small camera in my room after noticing my belongings mysteriously damaged. I recorded our conversations when she threatened me. I documented everything methodically, knowing someday this evidence would be my salvation. My parents remained oblivious to Jessica's true nature. When I achieved better grades than her, they attributed it to teachers favoring me. When I won a prestigious art competition, they suggested I must have copied someone else's work. When I was accepted to 3 colleges with scholarships, they barely acknowledged it while celebrating Jessica's single acceptance letter to a local community college. During these years, I perfected the art of appearing compliant while internally planning my liberation. I worked part-time jobs they knew nothing about, saving every penny. I maintained contact with supportive relatives away from my parents' watchful eyes. I built my escape route brick by brick, waiting for the right moment. This story was just beginning. The shy, forgotten Emily was evolving into someone they wouldn't recognize. Someone who would no longer accept being the family's shadow. The game of predator and prey was about to change, and neither Jessica nor my parents were prepared for what would come next. When Jessica graduated high school, our parents threw an extravagant party, praising her as if she were a prodigy. The reality? She had been accepted to only one mediocre college with no scholarships and average grades. Yet my parents couldn't have been prouder, eagerly offering to cover her entire tuition. I, Emily, had just one more year until my own graduation. I'd been waiting to see if my parents would treat me with the same generosity they showed Jessica. Then one day, Mom called me into the living room with an unusually serious expression. She delivered the news with casual cruelty. "Emily, we've put all our money toward Jessica's education, so there won't be anything left for you." She continued without hesitation. "You should get a job after graduation. If you want college, you'll have to wait until Jessica finishes." I froze. I'd expected unfairness, but not such blatant dismissal of my future. "What if I want to stay home while I wait?" I asked. Mom shrugged indifferently. "Then you'd have to pay for your food, utilities, and rent your room." When I mentioned student loans, Mom extinguished my last glimmer of hope. "We don't want you going into debt because of your impulsive decisions. If you insist on college, you'll need our permission, and we'll decide which schools are worth you taking on debt." They weren't just refusing to help. They were attempting to control my future, even as they abandoned it. What they didn't know was that I'd stopped trusting them long ago. Throughout high school, while they restricted my social life and stripped away every joy, I had channeled my isolation into relentless studying. I had devised a secret plan. I had applied for scholarships entirely on my own, and I had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. I had secured a full-ride scholarship to a prestigious university. But I didn't tell my parents immediately. Instead, I announced my achievement on social media first. A post thanking my family for raising me, my extended relatives for their support, and proudly declaring my full scholarship. My parents' reaction? Initially, they pretended to be proud, boasting to everyone who would listen. But then Jessica discovered the news and erupted in rage. She couldn't accept that I had outshined her. She began manipulating our parents. If I can barely survive college, how could Emily possibly manage? And if I'm failing, she'll definitely fail too. My parents performed a complete 180-degree turn. They suddenly feigned concern, asking if I was certain about attending college. They tried planting seeds of doubt, insisting I wouldn't survive without family support. But by then, I was no longer the naive child who believed their words. I left for college without any help from them, carrying only what I could fit in my second-hand car purchased with money from secret part-time jobs. The day I drove away, Mom stood on the porch with a conflicted expression, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her in years. Dad didn't even come outside. My first semester was exhilarating. I stepped into university life with a freedom I'd never experienced before. I made new friends who knew nothing of my history as Jessica's disappointing sister. I excelled in my classes, joined clubs, and began building the life I'd been denied for so long. Meanwhile, Jessica dropped out mid-semester and moved back home without having to pay a dime. My parents, predictably, welcomed her with open arms and endless excuses for her failure. During winter break, I hesitated to return home, but ultimately decided to face them, perhaps to prove to myself how far I'd come. The tension in the house was palpable. Jessica glared at me whenever our parents weren't looking. Mom and Dad asked superficial questions about school, but showed no real interest in my answers. On Christmas morning, they handed Jessica an envelope containing a check to start fresh next semester. More money than they'd ever considered giving me. My gift was a $20 gift card to a coffee shop that didn't exist in my college town. I left early the next day, promising myself it would be the last holiday I'd spend under their roof. I thought I had escaped their toxicity for good. Little did I know, a new nightmare was waiting for me just around the corner. When I returned to campus, strange things began happening. My scholarship office called me in, saying they'd received an anonymous report claiming I had falsified my application. My carefully organized research for an important paper disappeared from my laptop. Rumors started circulating that I'd cheated on exams. I recognized Jessica's handiwork immediately. She couldn't stand my success, and if she couldn't have what I'd earned, she was determined to destroy it. But this time, I wasn't alone and defenseless. I had friends, mentors, and a support system she couldn't infiltrate. I gathered evidence of the sabotage attempts, documented every strange occurrence, and presented my case to the dean. When they investigated the IP address behind the anonymous claims, it traced back to my parents' home computer. The university increased security on my academic records and offered counseling services. My professors, impressed by my resilience, became even stronger advocates for my success. What Jessica and my parents didn't understand was that their attempts to break me only made me more determined to succeed. By spring, I had secured an internship that would cover summer living expenses so I wouldn't have to return home. I changed my phone number and created new email accounts. I was cutting ties systematically, preparing for complete independence. When I met Daniel Carter during my junior year of college, I immediately recognized he was unlike anyone I'd ever known. Where I had learned to swallow injustice, Daniel confronted it head-on. He wasn't reckless or aggressive, he simply refused to let anyone walk over him or those he cared about. Our relationship deepened quickly. For the first time, I had someone who not only listened to my past traumas, but understood them on a visceral level. Daniel had grown up with a manipulative stepmother who played favorites with her biological children. He knew what it felt like to be the family scapegoat. "Some people don't deserve forgiveness, Emily," he told me one night after I'd shared particularly painful memories. "Some people need consequences." Daniel became not just the man I loved, but my fiercest advocate. When I hesitated to stand up for myself, old habits die hard, he would step in without hesitation. He helped me recognize my own worth in ways years of therapy couldn't accomplish. After graduation, Daniel proposed. It was a private, perfect moment between us, untainted by my family's toxicity. We agreed to a simple wedding, something meaningful rather than extravagant. I hadn't spoken to my parents in nearly 2 years by then, but something inside me, perhaps that little girl still seeking approval, wanted to give them one last chance. So I called them. To my surprise, they seemed delighted about the engagement and insisted on meeting Daniel. Warning him about what to expect, we visited them that weekend. The moment we arrived, I knew nothing had changed. Jessica, still living at home and working a part-time job that barely covered her personal expenses, dominated the conversation. My parents fawned over her opinions about wedding venues and dresses, as if she were the bride. Then came the proposal that left me speechless. "We'll cover all wedding expenses," my father announced over dinner, "if Jessica gets to wear a wedding dress and walk down the aisle before Emily." My mother nodded enthusiastically, adding, "You can't get married before your sister, dear. It wouldn't be right." I nearly vomited right there at the table. After everything, they were still trying to steal what should be my moment, trying to make Jessica the star of my wedding. I waited for Daniel to explode in righteous anger, but he didn't. Instead, he smiled, a smile I'd never seen before. It didn't reach his eyes, which had turned cold and calculating. "That's an interesting suggestion," he said carefully. "Emily and I will consider it." In the car afterward, I unleashed my fury. "How could you even pretend to consider that insanity?" Daniel's expression shifted to one of pure determination. "Because, Emily, we're not going to refuse. We're going to say yes. And then we're going to make them regret ever thinking they could manipulate us." That night, Operation Wedding Revenge was born. We wouldn't simply decline their toxic offer. We would accept it, then systematically dismantle their control until they were left humiliated and exposed. Daniel ingratiated himself with my parents by pretending to side with them on wedding decisions. We suggested the most affordable options for ourselves, then manipulated Jessica into demanding the most expensive alternatives, knowing my parents couldn't refuse her. When my mother presented me with an ugly wedding dress, Daniel praised her taste while I pretended reluctant acceptance. Behind the scenes, we purchased a stunning gown that would remain hidden until the perfect moment. We created fake wedding invitations for my parents to distribute to family and friends, complete with the wrong time, 2 hours later than the actual ceremony. We hired security who would have photos of my parents and Jessica with strict instructions not to let them in until the real ceremony was over. My parents were ecstatic, believing they'd successfully asserted their control one last time. They paid deposits on an extravagant venue, catering for 200 guests and the most expensive wedding planner in the city, all while thinking they were orchestrating their final humiliation of me. "Just think," my mother gushed during a dress fitting. "Everyone will see Jessica walk down the aisle looking radiant, and then, well, you'll have your turn too, Emily." I smiled meekly while rage burned inside me. "Yes, Mom, everyone will certainly see something they'll never forget." As the wedding date approached, my parents became increasingly invested in the spectacle they believed they were creating. They invited business associates, old friends they hadn't spoken to in years, and distant relatives, all to witness their perfect daughter Jessica steal the spotlight. What they didn't know was that every person they invited would receive a second, private invitation from us with the correct time, and a brief explanation of what my parents had demanded. We included excerpts from the journal I'd kept since childhood, documenting years of their favoritism and emotional abuse. They thought they were pulling the strings, but we were the puppet masters now. They believed they had me under their thumb one last time, but I was about to slip free forever. They had no idea that their crowning moment of control would become their day of reckoning. After months of deceiving my parents, our plan was finally ready. The night before the wedding, Jessica could barely contain her excitement, believing she would soon wear a wedding dress before me. My parents trusted Daniel completely, convinced he was on their side. I maintained my silence. I showed no doubt, no discomfort, because a clever prey never warns the predator that it's about to become the hunted. That morning, I woke up with butterflies in my stomach, not from fear, but from knowing today would be the day my parents would finally face consequences. Jessica was still smugly confident she would precede me down the aisle. Daniel played his part flawlessly, visiting my parents early, appearing nervous as he assured them, "Emily might be upset, but she won't dare do anything in this situation." My parents nodded, completely convinced. The wedding venue had been prepared exactly to our specifications. Guests had arrived in full, all at the correct time, thanks to our private invitations. My parents anxiously awaited the moment Jessica would make her grand entrance in her wedding dress. But then, Jessica was stopped at the door. A security guard stood before her, arms crossed, saying firmly, "I'm sorry, but you're not on the guest list." Jessica froze in disbelief. My mother rushed forward, screaming, "She's the bride's sister! Let her in!" But the guard didn't budge. "There's only one bride today, and she's already inside." Jessica began to shriek and wail, demanding entry. My father grew furious, threatening to call the police, but the security guard remained calm. "You're welcome to call them. Sir, I'm only following my contract." A small crowd of guests gathered to witness the commotion. One of my friends, tasked with creating chaos, suddenly called out loudly, "What's happening? Why did the bride's father leave on her wedding day?" Her words echoed throughout the hall. The entire room erupted in confused murmurs. When my father heard this, realization dawned on his face. We had tricked them. We had turned them into a spectacle. Daniel emerged from the ceremony space, looking directly at my parents and Jessica. He no longer needed to pretend. He smiled, a smile filled with mockery and triumph. "Oh, seems there's been some misunderstanding. Did we ever actually agree to let Jessica walk down the aisle?" he asked innocently. My parents stood frozen in shock. They had no proof of any arrangement. Jessica screamed, "You promised. You said you'd help me." Daniel shrugged casually. "Did I? Show me the evidence." And then they realized they had nothing. No messages, no emails, nothing in writing. Just verbal assurances they had foolishly believed. Inside the venue, our actual ceremony had already concluded. I had walked down the aisle in my stunning gown, not the ugly one my mother had chosen, with my favorite uncle giving me away. Our real guests had witnessed our vows, celebrated our union, and were now enjoying the reception. While my parents and Jessica remained outside, creating a scene that would become the subject of gossip for years to come, Daniel and I danced our first dance as husband and wife, surrounded by people who truly cared about us. Our extended family and friends had heard everything. The whispers began to spread through the crowd like wildfire. They actually planned to turn this into Jessica's wedding. How shameful. I always knew something was wrong with that family. My father attempted to regain control of the situation, but no one was listening to him anymore. The authority he'd wielded so confidently for decades had evaporated in minutes. My mother sobbed uncontrollably, mascara streaming down her face. Jessica sat on the ground, pounding her fists against the floor like a toddler throwing a tantrum. They had lost, not just the battle, but their credibility and dignity as well. Within hours of our ceremony, Jessica bombarded me with furious text messages. "You've ruined my life. Daniel is a two-faced snake. He'll betray you too. Just wait." Daniel saw the messages, took screenshots, and sent them to our family group chat, which included all our relatives who had witnessed today's spectacle. "See, she still hasn't learned her lesson," he wrote. My parents tried calling repeatedly, but I blocked their numbers. Daniel sent one final message to the group. "Please help me keep my in-laws and sister-in-law away from us. Emily and I want to enjoy our honeymoon without being harassed by these unhinged people." My relatives quickly responded, "Don't worry, we won't let them bother you two. Enjoy your time together, you deserve it after everything you've been through." I had won. They could no longer control me. The truth had been revealed, and I was finally free from their manipulation. Yet deep down, I knew this wasn't truly the end. Jessica had never learned to accept defeat. My parents had never known when to stop. Sooner or later, they would try to sabotage me again. But this time, I wasn't the helpless little girl they once knew. I was prepared. And if they dared come near me again, I wouldn't show mercy. The shadow had stepped into the light, and I refused to ever go back into the darkness. As Daniel and I left for our honeymoon, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and sadness. I had won my freedom, but at what cost? An entire childhood lost, a family broken beyond repair.